Before we get started, please don't forget to rate and review wherever possible. It really helps our podcast find the ears of listeners just like you. Also, if you have a story to tell, don't forget to submit it via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. You can also follow us anywhere socially at campfirecultpod and visit us online at campfirecultpod.com. Welcome, dear listener, to the Campfire Cult Podcast. From a camper van deep in the haunted woods, I bring you first-hand accounts of chilling encounters with the paranormal. Step into the night and take a peek into the realm where reality and the supernatural collide. My name is Jazz, and I'll be your host. And we're back. So sorry for the extended delay, but sometimes, life kind of gets in the way. Anyway, although I use AI voices to tell the stories, each episode takes, anywhere between 5 to 10 hours to produce. And honestly, I'm just a one-man band. Between finding the stories, training and tweaking the AI voices, and then finally editing and producing the final episode, there's no real quick or easy way to do this. Someday, I think I want to make a behind-the-scenes YouTube video on my process. Seems like some of you would be into that and would answer a lot of your questions. I also wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody that emailed and DM'd wanting another episode, and some even wanting to give via Patreon to help out if money was the issue for the delay. Thankfully, only time is the issue, but hoping to resolve that pretty soon. With that said, I'm giving the idea of Patreon some thought, but really only want to offer it if I can provide value for it in bonus episodes, merch, stuff like that. I think I have a plan for the bonus content and merch for those that want it, but more to come on that soon. Anyway, enough of my ramblings. Let's kick off this evening with a trilogy of stories from a therapeutic wilderness counselor that tells tales of her creepy encounters in the woods of eastern United States.
For about 2 years, I worked as an instructor at a therapeutic wilderness program in Western North Carolina. I was in charge of at-risk youth, and my job included all the responsibilities and nuances associated with that. Shifts ran 16 days straight, on the clock 24/7 of that time, and all spent backpacking. Most of this took place in Nantahala National Forest, DuPont State Forest, and Panthertown Valley. Here are some of the creepy things that happened to me and my groups out there. Without delving too much into programming and wilderness therapy in general, I do have to explain certain aspects of the job, so bear with me. Because none of these kids are voluntarily in the program. Some are a flight risk. To minimize the success of potential runaways, staff are required to sleep under an open tarp and between the doors of the tents. Often our setup looked like 2 tents facing under a large A-frame tarp, with staff sleeping between. Another precaution is called boot line. The kids' boots stay lined up under the gear tarp at night. Hard to run in your camp Crocs, you know? Anyhow, this boot line is visible from under the sleeping tarp. So this particular night, we were camped in some of the most far-flung areas the program goes to. We simply referred to it as Parkway Expo because our expedition often began with being dropped alongside the Blue Ridge Parkway and hiking into the rugged wilderness that surrounds it. It's a spot called Wet Camp Gap. From the sleeping tarp, I can see the boot line across camp in the direction of my feet. It's my job to wake up once every 3 hours for a silent head count. I wake up for my 3 a.m. check and turn on the red filter on my headlamp. I first scan the boot line, but have a weird feeling. Something isn't right. 13 pairs of boots. This takes some time to register. Usually when something doesn't feel right, there's a pair or 2 missing and a kid or 2 gone. There's only 12 kids, and at the end of the boot line, there's a pair of men's hunting boots. Staff boots aren't kept there, though. As this dawns on me in my sleepy haze, I snap to reality, sit up, and switch to my white light. It cast light across the camp, and the second the light fell on the hunting boots, the man who had been standing in them the whole time suddenly turned and walked off into the brush. That was a moment of sheer terror as I jumped up after him. He was long gone by the time I wiggled out of my sleeping bag. The following day, we were packing up and making breakfast when a group of 3 men walked through the field we were in. The trail runs right through it, so it's not unusual, but they came out of the woods from a strange angle perpendicular to the trail. I was over in the far corner of the camp with one co-instructor doing a daily briefing when they entered just a few yards away. They stopped and looked at us. All were armed. I recognized one's boots immediately. "You gave me a scare last night," I said. None of them spoke, only stared blankly at me. "You guys okay? You lost?" Still no response. The situation feels uneasy as they stare at us, gaze unbroken. "Here, let me show you my map." It's already in my hand. I get up from the stump I'm sitting on and approach. The trio suddenly turns and walks on across the clearing and out of view. I was glad we were moving the opposite way and only had one more night till our pickup and transport to base camp. That final night we're all sound asleep, about 2 a.m. or so. The night is broken by a blood-curdling scream. It's my female co-instructor. She's frantically running her fingers through her hair and completely inconsolable. I get her away from the group and calm down enough to speak. She says she woke up to what she assumed was a large spider or a mouse in her hair, but when she turned on her headlamp, she was greeted by the face of the tall-booted hillbilly in night vision goggles. He'd gotten almost a full braid in before she woke up, and he fled. We never saw any more of them, but she never came back for another shift either, the poor thing. A few weeks later, the local search and rescue found a woman who'd gone missing nearby. She'd been accosted by a man and tied to a tree, then left there. She was found alive something like 4 days later, still bound. Now on to my next story. Panthertown Valley is a special hiking and camping area within the larger Nantahala National Forest. Entirely different group this time. We were camped down on the valley floor, in a pine forest down from Salt Rock. This stand of trees is particularly creepy simply because it's cold and dark even on sunny days, but nights are plain eerie in there. It's getting toward bedtime and we're gathered around the fire having a nightly circle. The quiet evening ritual is broken by a huge crash. It's in the direction of our bear hang, where all of our food was suspended from a tree out of reach of bears and raccoons. We all boot up quick and ran over. The bags are all laying on the ground, but no animals in sight. Had the rope snapped? Nope. Looks like it came untied. I joke at my group's expense about shoddy knot work. They re-secure the setup and we return to camp and settle into bed. At about midnight, I hear a BAM! The bags have fallen again and now I'm mad. I don't like waking up to rehang food because of something as preventable as a second botched knot. I just wake up the boys, they swear they tied it right. Doesn't matter, we have to rehang it anyway. Everyone boots up and drags over. This time I'm gonna tie the damn knot. I'm mid-lecture/knot lesson when across the stand of pines, the dying fire suddenly goes black with a hiss, and our tents disappear into darkness. Someone had just doused our fire. We can hear their footsteps, now some behind us. We grab the food bags and run back to the tents and nobody is there. But we can hear footsteps all around us in the woods, and the sound of branches being broken off trees everywhere. This went on until at least 4 a.m. The next morning, the only evidence was a plethora of freshly broken off pine branches and a half-charred baby doll hanging from the rope where our food had been. On to my last weird but true story. My second winter there, I was with a group at our primitive base camp. Basically a collection of different yurt camps on the grounds of an old Christian camp. It had just snowed that evening, and a fresh blanket had covered camp in the hours since we laid down for bed. At about 1 a.m., a student woke me to go pee. I was required to stay awake until he got back in. He did his duty, then returned to the yurt. "There's somebody out there," he whispered nonchalantly. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I saw a guy up by the fire pit just now. Dude in a flannel shirt just standing there." I got up and looked out the yurt window. Nothing. I figure he's probably just out of it. We go back to sleep. About an hour or so later, I have to pee. I slip my camp shoes on and walk outside the yurt. Upon returning, I glance up by the fire pit to see a man standing there in the moonlight looking at me. I could see the plaid pattern on the flannel, it was so bright. I immediately go for my brand new high-powered handlight and cast 900 lumens at him. He vanished before the beam hit him, just gone. I wake up a co-instructor and we search camp to make sure another group doesn't have a run-in or something like that, but there's nobody. Even more unsettling than that, there's not a single footprint in the fresh snow around camp.
Next, in the middle of nowhere, at a clandestine hangout spot known as The Tunnel, a group of friends has a possible encounter with a skinwalker.
My friends and I had this hangout spot in the middle of nowhere that we would go drink and smoke weed at, called The Tunnel. It wasn't a real tunnel, just a dirt road with tall trees on either side that looked like a tunnel. Anyways, the guys in our friend group would always tell us scary stories that had happened to them while they were there. I just thought they were trying to scare us because every time before this night, nothing creepy had ever happened. We had snuck out, and it was the middle of the night, probably around 1 or 2 in the morning. We were drinking and just sitting in the car talking, when suddenly my friend in the driver's seat whispers, "What's in the middle of the road up there?" I looked and didn't see anything, so I said, "There's nothing in the road. Your eyes are playing tricks on you." And he insists that yes, there is something in the road, and the passenger says that he also sees something. I laugh and say, "Bullshit, you guys are just trying to scare us." The driver puts the car into drive and starts slowly rolling forward. Suddenly, a figure emerges from the darkness. It was a man standing right in the middle of the road watching us drive towards him. He had no shoes, had no shirt, and was wearing shorts. It was a cold fall night, and he was wearing shorts. This was a dirt road, and he had no shoes on. His eyes were glowing yellow like a deer's eyes in the headlights. We all start screaming and freaking out. The driver asks if he should stop, and we all yell for him to just drive. The man continues to stare as we are driving towards him. Then once we get only about 10 feet away from him, he calmly walks to the side of the road and vanishes. This road had tall fences with even taller willows overgrown over it. It was probably about 10 to 12 feet tall. There's no way a normal man could have just cleared that. I have never seen anyone's eyes glow in headlights before, like a deer. It wasn't a reflection though, but rather a glow from inside. We were all pretty certain that this man was a skinwalker, as the tunnel was not too far from Skinwalker Ranch. I try, but I still cannot think of a logical explanation for what we saw that night. Probably never will.
Next up, a seasoned hunter finds himself in a terrifying encounter during a night hunt, leading him to question whether he narrowly escaped a supernatural threat or simply encountered a deranged individual in the shadows of the wilderness.
Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you that don't know, boar are a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 or more pigs. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boar and coyote. I'd been saving for a year, mostly fun money, but it's hard to explain to your wife that a scope that costs literally twice as much as the rifle I was mounting it on was worth it. But I bought it and took it to a range and sighted it in. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck, with easy-to-find spots that I could set up and that overlooked a large, easy-to-navigate clearing. The night started uneventful. Mostly me tinkering with my new toy, cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I'd spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season. And like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot I'd seen days earlier that probably wasn't much better than my first. But it gave me something to do, and a new angle to look around with my new scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. This spot doesn't have much animal activity at all. No rabbit or owls. The deer that I'd seen were hundreds of yards from where I was. Why was this pocket of land so dead at night but lively in the day? I'd set up around 10 p.m., and it was about 2 a.m. when I started to think about packing up, maybe setting up a target before I left and taking some practice shots. I heard a crunch come from the direction I came from before. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in the Predator movies. I adjusted my range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting a little when I saw that it wasn't really a bear. It was a man. Because he was so low and hunched over, I thought I was looking at a young bear. Is that a game warden? It couldn't be. I would have seen the headlights coming up the road from where I was perched. And where could he have walked from? I was 30 miles away from anything and on public lands. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights and noticed he was naked. No shoes, pants, or anything. I remember being disturbed by his movements like a squirrel or something. Twitchy and grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around and palming the tree. Was that my tree? The one I'd been leaning against earlier? The thought terrified me and I wondered, could he smell me? Then he did something I still have nightmares about today. He squatted and placed his hands in the dirt between his feet and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl. And I heard it, a voice coming from that direction, a very compelling female voice.
Help! I'm lost!
There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sights was trained at the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything I'd been taught about firearms. Were they lost, or was this some guy that had gone crazy out here? Why was his voice so feminine?
Help, please, I can't walk.
The voice called out, and that's when I called bullshit. Not only could he walk, when I first saw him, he was traversing the land with ease for a naked person. So good I mistook him for a bear. That's a fucking trap. This guy is trying to lure me to him with a damsel in distress routine. Luckily, the lack of activity before had caused me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but I didn't give a shit in that moment. I took my eyes off him for a moment to get my pack on. I buckled my chest strap and scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and I swear I saw a smile. The thermal scope has an effect that makes animals' eyes appear white. How the hell had he heard me get up and put my gear on? He must have easily been 150 yards away when I screamed in his direction. "Fuck off, I have a gun." He stood upright, and it hit me how tall and skinny he was. Easily 6 feet and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction, and I instinctively sent a round sailing above his head into the tree line. He was freaky as hell, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I was unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and hunched down on all fours. "The next one will fuck you up. Go away," I said. He stayed on all fours, and this time I had my sights trained on the center of him. His eyes were just above the grass like a large cat or something. I was trying to stop my trembling and knew that my voice had cracked a little on that last warning. I was terrified, and that standoff probably only lasted a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In an instant, he bolted left towards the tree line opposite the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep him in my scope. He was moving so fast. He disappeared into the brush, and I sent another bullet sailing high in his direction. I racked another round and tried to pocket that mag and swap for a fresh one, but I dropped it and didn't bother looking for it. I wasn't far from my truck, and I wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance yelling in this weird sound that could have been a laugh or a cry. I scrambled up the trail and arrived at my truck breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab but kept the rifle in the passenger seat and sped off. For the longest time, I told that story from the perspective of having spotted some deranged crackhead living off the land, like some kind of caveman. I reported it to Fish and Game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone. Never received an update. It wasn't until I told this story at a camping trip that my nephew told me about Wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story scared the piss out of him, because the spot we were camping was technically the same forest I'd seen that thing. We were just 50 miles east of it. He was so spooked his mom, my cousin, had to take him home. She was a little upset with me. I've gone down the rabbit hole with these scary stories, I'm not saying. What I saw definitely was a Wendigo or a skinwalker. I'm saying that if such a thing exists, I may have dodged quite the bullet that night.
Coming up next, in the summer before her senior year in college, a young woman trying out her little brother's new night vision goggles embarks on a solo adventure into a nearby nature preserve, only to discover she's being stalked in the dark.
It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, always interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday, and he'd left them at my apartment. One night I was bored and decided to go try out the goggles at a wooded hiking area and nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a very stupid idea since I was all by myself. But I was young and stupid, and I got myself all excited at the possibility of seeing deer and other woodland creatures in their natural nighttime habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked there at night before, and we'd never run into anyone else. Our area is mostly rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign, "Park closes at 10, and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered down through the canopy of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I'd found a place to sit down, so I lit my way with the mini mag light on my keychain. A couple of times I thought I heard a little rustling in the woods a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and I attributed it to animal activity. Hopefully the deer I'd come hoping to see. After I'd hiked a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on and put on the goggles. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn near pitch darkness into bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but quite bright and clear. For a while, I had a blast looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby, and a big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer, though, and I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me, darkness or not, if I sat right out in the open on a log. So I decided to find a place where I could be a little more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods and finally found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for my deer. I didn't get to see any. What I did see, lit up in bright night vision green after about 10 minutes of waiting, was this. A man, dressed head to toe in dark-colored clothing, making his way stealthily through the woods. He was coming from the same direction I'd come and was clearly trying to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree and glancing around carefully before moving on again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice that he was carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, and it was a big one, and he was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. It wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve where hunting of any kind was prohibited. And at any rate, the guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter. There were no deer in sight, and very few hunters, if any, kill their prey with knives. I was suddenly horribly aware of my situation. A young woman alone, weaponless in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, so no cell phones, and even if I'd had one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it lest I draw his attention directly to me. I didn't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes had just adjusted, and I was terrified he would look up and see me. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for who or whatever the hell he was stalking. I scanned around but couldn't see anyone else, even from my high vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises I'd heard in the woods when I first arrived, and then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I'd been annoyed and a little freaked out at the time, but when I'd turned into the nature preserve parking area, the white car had passed me and driven on its way, and I hadn't thought anything more of it. Now I wondered, horrified, if this was the driver of that car, if he'd circled back and seen my parked car, alone in the lot. Did he come in after me? I sat paralyzed with fear and watched the man for what felt like forever, but was probably another half hour or so. There was a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree, and I was sure he was going to look up and find me, but he didn't. After a while, he seemed to give up on whatever plan he had in mind. I heard him say, "Fuck it," and he started heading back in the direction he'd come, the direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, wet with sweat and crying a little until the sun came up a few hours later. Then I climbed down and, still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain,
I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and he had scraped all down the sides of the car with something sharp. Probably his knife. I'm lucky it didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for the night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me, and thank God for big trees with sturdy branches.
Our next story is a wild one, in which a seasoned photographer is stalked by a crimson cloaked entity while exploring the wilds of the Pacific Northwest.
It all began almost a month ago when I was approached with this idea. For some backstory, but not too much for privacy concerns, I am a photographer for a pretty well-known magazine. My job consists of mostly traveling to beautiful destinations, seeking out all there is to see, and snapping photos. Now, of course, there's more to it than that, and I take great pride in my work. But that's the gist of it. It truly is my dream job. Well, was my dream job. After all of this, I don't know if I can continue. The subject of my latest adventure is the U.S. Pacific Northwest. Specifically, the wild and beautiful wilderness it contains. My first stop was in the Northern Cascades. Here I would be backpacking 20 miles into the national park with stops along the way. Loaded up with enough gear and food for 4 days out in the wilderness, I began my trek. Now, I should say that my employer, well, they're not the most lucrative company in terms of how they treat their photographers. They pay well, but not that well. And hiring me an assistant? Out of the question. But the job does have its perks, including access to many places off limits to the general public, including the areas I would be visiting along my journey. Luckily, I've been doing this for a few years now, and hiking 20 miles in 60-degree weather is paradise compared to some of the things I've had to withstand in my career. Around 10 p.m. of the first day, I pitched my tent and hunkered down, went over some photos of marmots, deer, and a fox that I'd captured, then put out the lantern and got some rest. I awoke around 2 a.m. to a loud banging noise off in the distance. Not unusual, but still unsettling. The thing about camping alone so far from anything is there's no one to talk to, no one to bounce ideas off of, no one to rationalize with, and no one to calm you down when you can't keep it together. The noise subsided though, and so did my lucidity. My eyes fell heavy and I collapsed back into sleep. The next day went just as well, and I reached my destination, catching some beautiful vistas along the way. After capturing everything I had set out to do, I made camp and relaxed for the night. Again, I awoke to loud banging. This was definitely closer, and also accompanied by something new and incredibly unnerving. A noise that is hard to describe. I've tried thinking of ways to describe it, but the closest I can come would be to liken it to something like an owl's hoot, but much longer, and with the pitch lowered way down. Something like a bullfrog's croak, but even lower and much louder, and with that weird little coo that owls have. I've talked to several park rangers since then and even played a recording that I caught of one on my phone, but no one has been able to identify it. It echoes in my mind even as I write this. It's hard to describe how bone-chilling it is, and I have no idea why. And to hear it when you're so far out alone with no cell service or any way of signaling for help, I can't even describe the feeling. Despite the enormous dread, the sound again went away after just a few moments. This time, though, getting back to sleep wasn't as easy. After an hour of laying in total silence, clenching my bear spray, I finally fell back asleep. But you want to know what the worst part was? Knowing the next morning that I still had 2 days left out here. Except that wasn't going to work for me. I packed up as fast as I could and began hiking back at a brisk pace. I worked out that if I walked faster and with fewer breaks, I could make it back in a little over a day, meaning I would only need to stay 1 more day in this place. And that by then I would be much closer to the main trails, and therefore safer. I walked 12 hours straight, with only 2 slight breaks, and managed to make it even further than I expected. At this pace, I could reach the truck by 1 a.m. if I walked straight through. And though I was exhausted as hell, that's exactly what I did. Everything went pretty well until about 10:45 p.m., only a few minutes after total darkness had fallen over the forest, when again I began hearing the noise. The sounds had an otherworldly quality to them, like a cat's purr if you reversed it, lowered the pitch and filtered it through a megaphone. My legs were burning, but it didn't matter. I walked even faster. No matter how fast or slow I walked, though, the noises always sounded the same distance away. It never got closer to me, but it was always close and seemingly just out of eyesight. After over an hour of this nightmare, I caught a glimmer of the brown trailhead sign, and beyond that, the reflection of my Jeep's headlights. I ran, threw my supplies in the back tailgate, and hightailed it out of there. But this is where things get even weirder. As I was pulling away in my rearview mirror, I caught a small glimpse of what was causing the noises. At the time, I didn't know what I was even seeing. Something tall, very tall, with a darkness around it that seemed to repel the ambient red glow from my taillights. Around it, a long tattered robe, seemingly crimson in color, though this could have been due to my taillight's glow. Either way, the image was visually striking and physically jarring. As the dust trail left by my Jeep grew in size, the figure slowly faded back into the surrounding forest. Now, if this all sounds crazy, well, you damn right it is. I have been to some incredible places, and some very frightening places, but I have never seen or felt anything like this before. But it doesn't end there, unfortunately. 2 days later, the next wing of my trip took me to Mount Rainier National Park. I was a little nervous, but now I was 200 miles away. Whatever it was surely gone now. If you've never been, the sheer vastness and beauty of Mount Rainier is breathtaking. So after half a day of taking in the sights, the uneasiness faded away. Even the first night went by without issue. A little hesitant at first, I quickly felt relaxed enough to drift asleep staring up at the stars through the observation window in my tent. Waking the next morning, I found nothing out of place and nothing suspicious, confirming that whatever it was truly was far away. Another 2 days of hiking went by without any issues or disturbances, aside from a few cougar sightings and a pack of wolves in the distance. It wasn't until my last night that I experienced it again. Sleeping on my last night less than 3 miles from my Jeep, the same noises woke me in the middle of the night. Except this time it was very, very close. I shot up, grabbed my light, and shined it outside of the tent. Immediately, the light caught a glimpse of what I could now confirm was an old, tattered, crimson-red robe gliding behind a giant evergreen. I became frozen in fear. My still-waking mind could not even comprehend what I was seeing or what was happening. The demonic purring noises seemingly teased me from behind the tree. Now fully lucid, I began to contemplate my options. Option 1, make a run for it, leaving all my gear behind, the least likely. Not only would I be leaving literally tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment, but I would have no chance of sprinting the 3 miles needed to reach the Jeep. Besides that, whatever this was had to be fast to reach me so quickly, and also incredible at tracking. So option 1 was a no-go. Option 2, spray the shit out of this thing with bear spray and then run for it. Only slightly better than option 1, still not viable. And option 3, the least fun but probably most logical option. Remain in the tent until morning and defend myself if I have to. And so I did. I'm not sure what time I woke up. I was too nervous to even look at my phone, but I do know it was hours before sunlight. About 30 minutes after the first rays reached my tent, the noises finally went away. It was another 45 minutes before I felt safe enough to pack up and begin the hike back. I reached my Jeep and again broke every law in the park on my way out, leaving tire marks in the freshly paved road out. I rented a hotel and regrouped, talking to a few friends of mine who were frequent hikers in the area. None of them had ever experienced anything like this, and only one actually believed everything I was saying. I decided to skip my next 2 stops, Olympics National Park and the Hoh Rainforest. Employer be damned, it doesn't take a genius to realize that would be a bad idea. So I decided to just go straight for my last stop, a much safer option, Cannon Beach, Oregon. Here, I would just be taking some photos of legendary Haystack Rock at different times of day, sunrise, sunset, and some astrophotography shots with the rock as the subject. Even better, I would be staying in a seaside room with a view of the rock so I could take shots from my balcony without even going outside. Again, the first day went by with no issues. Photos came out great, and it was time to get my rig set up for some time-lapse photos of the rock against the night sky. Seeing as I was on the 3rd floor and everything was automated, I decided to let the rig do its work and get some rest. Because of the skipped stops, I would have extra days here in case they didn't come out perfect the first time. I woke the next morning to find my entire setup on the ground outside on the balcony. The whole thing weighed close to 50 pounds, so even though the gusts near the shore got pretty strong, I was doubtful that was the cause. Luckily, nothing was damaged, so I wasn't too concerned until I checked the SD card. The first 2 hours of the time-lapse went great, but then something odd started to emerge in the photos. In the corner of each frame, a red tint began to slowly encompass the image, until the photos were nothing but crimson red cloth. That was last night, and I'm afraid things aren't getting better. I'm packing the Jeep and planning on leaving for the airport immediately. But something strange happened again. Today, in broad daylight, as I was catching one last look at the beach and all the tourists taking photos, atop the rock, I saw a tall, dark figure in a long, tattered crimson robe.
Next, a man haunted by a childhood encounter tells a chilling tale of a mysterious whistler while on a camping trip in South Dakota.
When I was about 8 years old, I was taking my dog for a walk through the neighborhood with my mom. It was maybe 11 p.m., and we live next to a swampy, wooded area on the edge of our neighborhood in Lansing, Michigan. I remember it being very silent and slightly windy, and from down in the swamp, we heard somebody whistling at us. It sounded sort of like a bird, but each whistle was different enough where the lack of consistency made it human-like. My mom had a concerned, slightly terrified look on her face, grabbed my hand, and said that we should go inside quickly. I didn't understand because I was too young, but seeing my mom freak out made me freak out too, and after a while, though, I kind of forgot about it. 2 years later, I was taking my dog out again, late at night, and there was a large bush that could easily obscure a person behind it, just next to the front door. As I was finishing the walk, the whistling noise started again. Same pitches, same inconsistent, human-like tones. As soon as I heard it, a chill went down my spine as I remembered exactly the feeling of seeing my mom, terrified, looking down into the swamp at something I couldn't see, maybe she couldn't either, and I ran inside as fast as possible. Years went by, and I thought about it less and less. I told only a handful of people, and eventually, it slipped from my mind. Fast forward to last summer. My girl Sarah and I moved out to South Dakota for work. On Independence Day, we decided to go to Pierre, South Dakota, and watch the fireworks along the bank of the Missouri River. There was a free camping spot behind a hospital where you could pitch your tent, hang out, and see the fireworks up the river. We were near the end of the campground, and there were very few people around us. As it was getting dark, the fireworks began. They were pretty far away, so the illumination they brought was very little, and we had to sit right at the edge of the river to be able to see them. A huge thunderhead was moving in, and a storm was imminent, so the air seemed electric and the wind was picking up. The atmosphere was eerie, to say the least. The police boats herded all the other boats off of the river and had left our area to do that elsewhere. Most of the other campers walked up the river to have a better view of the fireworks, but Sarah and I stayed back and were drinking PBR tallboys and kicking it. Suddenly, we heard the sound of a paddle methodically dipping into the water, and we saw a figure steering a canoe about 20 feet offshore. Sarah decided to go get more beers from the car, leaving me alone to stare at this mystery person, and then, of course, they started whistling at me. My entire body was frozen and covered in goosebumps. It was the exact same whistler from my childhood, more than a decade earlier. I looked at the figure, but it was much too dark to discern who it could be. They were wearing a hat. When they were perpendicular to the shore from me, they stopped paddling, turned the canoe to face directly at me, and whistled right at me. I was so frightened, I stood up and shouted at them, "Who are you?" They didn't say anything, just whistled a couple more times, turned the canoe 180 degrees, and paddled out of sight. I'm a videographer, so I already had my camera by my side and was taking video of the fireworks. As the canoe was almost out of sight, I grabbed my camera and got a shot of them whistling as they went away. When Sarah came back from getting beers, she was very confused as to why I was so freaked out, and when I explained, she was freaked out a bit too. I was convinced we would both be murdered that night. How did this whistling person follow me, after 14 years, all the way to South Dakota? Was it a coincidence? Why was it the same whistling noise? Who was that person and where did they go? So many questions still unanswered. To this day, I'm still afraid of being outside in the dark where I might hear that whistling again.
After a bit of searching, I came across another entity known for whistling named El Silbon of South America. And so sorry if I butchered that name. It was not intentional. Known as a towering, thin creature stalking the countryside of the Llanos region in South America, carrying the bones of its victims in a sack and whistling as it moves. Vengeful and full of murderous intent, if one hears the whistle, it is likely already too late. Referred to as the Terror of the Plain, El Silbon, or the Whistler, is an emaciated figure more than 3 meters tall, with elongated limbs and an old sack slung over its back. Also known as El Sinfin, the Endless, it's a malevolent ghost cursed by its grandfather for killing his own father. Roaming the plains of the Llanos region, El Silbon is deeply connected to the landscape. The entity is said to hunt for womanizers, cheaters, and drunks, seeking revenge for the actions that led to its cursed existence. Legend has it that the boy's grandfather cursed him after witnessing the murder of his father, subjecting him to torture and releasing him to hungry and rabid dogs. Since then, El Silbon has been roaming the roads, carrying his father's remains in a sack and murdering those who come across his path, all while whistling a haunting melody. Do you think the man from the previous story came across El Silbon and lived to tell the tale? Shoot me an email and let me know what you think. Now, on to our final story of the evening. In the rugged landscapes of mountainous central Idaho, a family's routine fire gathering trip takes a terrifying turn and leaves them haunted by the chilling screams echoed in the darkness.
In many rural areas of the American West, cutting firewood in national forests is a necessary chore if you want a warm house through the winter. Our home in mountainous central Idaho was no exception. It was normal for my dad to pick me and my brothers up after school and head into the mountains for an afternoon of firewood gathering. My dad would fell the dead trees, then saw them into chunks. My brothers and I had the task of rolling the wood to the truck and loading it. We would continue this assembly line process until we had a truckload of wood, usually before nightfall. Hot, sweaty, and exhausted, we would pile into the truck cab and make our way down the mountain. At home the next day, we would unload and split the wood and stack it into neat little rows. This process was repeated until we had a winter's worth of fuel for our house, our grandma's cabin, and any extra for elderly neighbors. This particular afternoon, we decided to try a different logging road on the other side of the valley. This was well outside our familiar logging area. No real reason for the change, but my dad said he wanted a change of scenery. This logging road hadn't been maintained in some time. Large rocks and fallen branches littered the path. My brothers and I had to walk out in front, pushing rocks and wood out of the way as my dad lurched the truck up the switchbacks. Yard by yard, we slowly made our way up the mountain. That hike was physically brutal. As we ascended the mountain and got farther into the trees, this odd feeling started to set in. I wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion from the hike or something more, but there was electricity in the air, like the whole mountain was buzzing at a wavelength just below my senses. In some odd way, it felt like the mountain knew we were there, and it wasn't welcome to that fact. I wanted to say something to my brothers, but before I opened my mouth, my younger brother said, "Does anyone else feel like we're not welcome here?" My older brother and I stopped in our tracks and looked back at him. Both of us nodded in agreement. This moment was broken by my dad honking and motioning us to continue clearing the path. Reluctantly, we pushed forward to a small clearing in the woods where we finally stopped the truck. My dad, oblivious to our apprehension, or simply choosing to ignore it, grabbed his saw and went to work. As the wood was felled and loaded, I couldn't shake this ominous feeling enveloping me like a dark shroud. I noticed my brothers were taking occasional glances over their shoulders as we worked. Everyone but my dad, it seemed, was on edge. The sun nestled down into the trees and twilight began to set in. As the light drained from the sky, my anxiety only intensified. It wasn't until my dad unexpectedly told us to load up that a wave of relief flooded over me. I could see the tension in my brothers melt away as well. The truck wasn't fully loaded, an oddity. Getting a half load was a waste, according to my dad. We would sometimes work into the dark just to make sure the truck was full. But tonight he seemed eager to head home. With everything loaded, we started down the road. Although dead tired, everyone seemed to be in a much lighter mood. We were chatting and cracking jokes while trying to blow off steam from the afternoon. We were almost out of the tree line and into the valley desert. Going down the switchbacks, you want to be careful, especially with a load, even if it was half that. A brown blur jumped up from the downslope side of the switchback. "Shit," was the only word that came out of my dad's mouth as he slammed on the brakes. Loaded with wood and traveling downhill, there was no way to avoid smashing into the blur. The truck finally ground to a standstill. The four of us peered through the windshield, and nobody saying a word. Illuminated in the yellow glow of our headlights was a crumpled body of a deer. Grumbling and cursing the deer's existence, my dad exited the truck to investigate. Doing as they were told, my brothers stayed put in the truck. I didn't listen. Following close behind my dad, the truck was fine. We hadn't been traveling fast when we smacked the deer. Just some hair and blood in the grill guard. Hitting a deer really wasn't that unusual. The mountains were full of them. What was unusual was that the deer dropped so quickly. At faster speeds, deer could still be upright and sprinting away to die in the woods after a collision. That last burst of an adrenaline dump. This one fell over like a rag doll. Before even approaching the carcass, a deep, foul smell hit us. Deer smell bad when they're alive, but this was on a whole other level. It was the smell of decay and rot. My stomach began to turn as we got closer. My nostrils were burning, and coming up on the deer, it was clearly dead. Really, really dead, and the stench was so overwhelming my eyes were watering. The body was a true horror scene. The deer's eyes were gone, replaced with a sunken, hollow hole. As if to overcompensate for their absence, the tongue was swollen and black as coal. It could not be contained and hung out the side of its mouth. The underbelly was split open. Entrails and offal spilled into the dirt. In the dim headlights, it looked as though the deer's fur and viscera were moving. Wiggling almost, and holding my breath, I bent down for a closer look and my heart stopped. The deer, inside and out, was covered in maggots. It was dead all right, but our truck didn't kill it. Clearly it had been dead for days, if not weeks. I backed away, retching. That electric anxiety came screaming back. My dad was always the quiet, stoic type, but right now, even in the dim headlights of the truck, I could see the abject horror in his face. His gaze wasn't on the deer, but focused down the mountain. Poorly masking the fear in his voice, he told me firmly to walk back to the truck and get inside. I obeyed without objection. As I grabbed the door handle, a loud shriek came out of the trees. Branches were shattering and breaking. Something was heading up the slope towards us. I slammed my door closed just as my dad reached the truck. Before his door was shut, he pressed on the accelerator. The truck launched forward, sending us over the deer carcass and racing downhill. With mine and my brothers yelling, it was hard to tell if the shrieking was following us. Our truck popped out of the tree line and into the desert sagebrush. Once out of the woods, everything quieted down. We were left with only the rumble of the engine and wind through the half-opened windows. Pulling into our property, the truck came to a stop. We sat in silence, but no one moved to leave the truck. What was the screaming? How does a dead deer jump uphill in front of a truck? There was no way the truck killed it. Dad just shook his head and motioned for us to quiet down. That deer was dead when we hit it. It didn't jump out in front of us. It was thrown at us. We stared at him, and he explained that all day up on the mountain he had felt uneasy. Not wanting to worry us boys, he kept it to himself. He described it like walking into a stranger's living room while they were upstairs asleep. That feeling never left him. And as twilight came, he happened to catch a shadow in the corner of his eye. Not far into the woods, he saw figures moving from tree to tree. He couldn't focus on them long enough for a good look before they dodged behind trees. His stomach dropped. Working hard to keep his composure, he hurried us to the truck to leave. It was after hitting the deer and discovering it was long dead that my dad pieced together what was happening. Something threw that deer to get us to stop. Before the shrieking began, he could hear something moving in the darkness beyond the road. It was a trap. Running back to the truck could have started an ambush or triggered a prey drive. So we walked back to the truck. The second we were inside, he drove that truck downhill with no intention of stopping for anyone or anything. That feeling of electricity didn't disappear until we hit the county highway. My brothers and I never saw anything as we drove away, but those screams from the forest will never leave my mind. We didn't gather firewood the rest of the season. For the first time in his life, my dad just bought what we needed. And although we started to gather wood again the next season, we've never been back up that particular mountain. The Forest Service has permanently closed and reclaimed that road. The only way back up into those woods is a long hike, and one I'm not interested in ever taking again. Whatever was on that mountain, whatever threw that deer carcass, whatever chased us out of the woods, it did not want us there. It wanted us gone, or worse, it wanted us dead.
And that's all for tonight, dear listeners. Again, so sorry for the delay. More to come next week, and until that time, I'll be leaving you in the dark where whispers linger and shadows dance. Stay wary, sleep well, and beware the whistlers in the night. If you have a story to tell, please reach out via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave me a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. You can follow us anywhere on social media at campfirecultpod and online at campfirecultpod.com. And finally, if you don't mind, please rate and review wherever possible.